Oh, the 2000s, an era in which you saw a lot of action movies try to be pretty much on par with a lot of Hong Kong Chinese cinema. All right, you had a lot of directors who were influenced by action directors of Chinese cinema trying to bring that into America. Or in this case, you had some Chinese directors coming from their humble home, coming over to America and putting their own stamp on things. And I'll tell you, as much as I got my problems with this movie, I cannot deny this is a product of that period. And this is action. And I don't mean just action, people. This I understand this is an action movie, but when I say for the 2000s that this was an action movie, ooh, I mean this was emphasized to the 10th degree, no questions about it. Action movies can vary, but this was definitely very much a product of the time.
You gotta be kidding.
This message will destruct in 5 seconds.
Mission Impossible 2 is directed by John Woo with a screenplay by Robert Towne and a story by Ronald D. Moore and Brannon Braga. The film stars Tom Cruise, Dougray Scott, Thandiwe, Richard Roxburgh, John Polson, Brendan Gleeson, Rade Šerbedžija, and Ving Rhames. According to IMDb's plot synopsis, IMF agent Ethan Hunt is sent to Sydney to find and destroy a genetically modified disease called Chimera. The first Mission Impossible movie grossed over $400 million, which led to the film's success to make a franchise out of this. I mean, you go from $80 million and you just now grossed over $400 million. Oh yeah, you're sold. You're good. All right, let's make sequels out of this bitch. 4 years later, a sequel would be released in 2000. Glorious year that it is. With Hong Kong action director John Woo behind the camera, this one would be more action packed. And like I said at the beginning of this video, this is more action than anyone could ever imagine. I have always thought that this film, if you ask me, has always been pretty much the black sheep in this franchise. Because if you compare it to the other movies, okay, you have Mission Impossible 1, and then let's say you skip this one, you go to 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and now soon the 8th movie. They're all pretty much how the series has been, right? Like ever since the first movie. Well, wouldn't you know it? This one tries to shake things up a little bit. Something that kind of went against the series, if you will. And I really was not crazy about this movie when I watched it for the first time. And after rewatching it, I still think that this is probably the most out of place and generic film in this franchise. Because when you go to Mission Impossible, most people can tell you how much that the films are so reliant on having a very much structured film with regards to having the team be the center focus. And while the first movie had that for a little bit and then got rid of it, it still had somewhat of a team-esque feel to it with regards to a spy genre. This one went, hey, let's just be like James Bond. And what I mean by James Bond, I mean let's try to rework Ethan Hunt as to being a ladies' man like James Bond is. And before giving my issues with this movie, because I don't think that this is an absolute terrible movie, here are the positives I have to say. The performances are fine. Nobody is terrible in this movie. Tom Cruise is still entertaining as Ethan Hunt. No matter what, he always brings it to this role. I think around this time where Tom Cruise started to do his own stunts. Not to say that he never did, but like actually showcase it. This was now starting to showcase Tom Cruise as being action man material as it kept going, and he was actually doing the stunts, and it was being filmed on camera. You could see him actually doing them, and for that, I think that even to this day, you could tell how much Tom Cruise always puts his effort and literally his mind and body in the most dangerous and just downright scary scenarios, but he manages to pull them off, and he manages to do it all himself without no help. But then again, I'm pretty sure they had help on standby whenever this man did something crazy. on set with regards to his stunts. Ving, who I enjoyed in the first movie as Luther Stickler, and the reason why I didn't mention him in the first movie was because as much as I did like him and I liked him and Ethan's banter, I just didn't mention him just simply because of the fact that he just wasn't in it as much as the other movies would kind of have him in them. He is still fun as Luther Stickler here. Though not given much, he was a fun, enjoyable part of this movie, and along with seeing both Cruise and Rhames' chemistry that they had in the first movie, they still have great rapport with each other, and they are easily making the film enjoyable. Like, out of the two actors, they're the ones that I'm like, all right, they look like they know what they're doing, and they really seem like they are having a fun time with each other in terms of being on set and having that chemistry still continue on from the first movie into this movie. The direction is solid. Director John Woo delivers on an explosive and crazy blockbuster that fits for a summer watch. Bringing his experience of action, he clearly emphasizes it. I know I seem like I'm repeating myself, you guys, but I'm being serious when I say this. John Woo is a very intense and very visceral action director who really emphasizes what his action goes for. If you look at some of his works from Hong Kong, something like the Hard Boiled series, clearly this man has an affinity for when it comes to action films, and is no different here. And as much as I do think that if you compare this to what Brian De Palma did, or even the other directors, I can at least say that he still stands out in his own ways. It's not like the direction here is terrible or anything. It clearly shows his passion and love for action movies being on display here, and showing how much his influence that he has had in his career in Hong Kong is being brought into America. And so I don't necessarily think he's terrible in that regard. The action is, dare I say it, cool. A lot of effort was clearly put on how practical and exciting the action can be. All the more, the action is pretty impressive. Even to this day, I'm still impressed with some of the action pieces that are in this movie. And while I do have my issues with them, not necessarily the action, but rather the problems with the said action sequences, clearly a lot of practicality, a lot of stunt work, a lot of hand-to-hand combat was put into this movie to make sure that the feeling of Mission Impossible, but rather just the explosive nature of a summer action movie, is on full display. The music is enjoyable, though a lot heavy on the rock compared to, say, what Danny Elfman did with the previous score. Composer Hans Zimmer, yes people, Hans Zimmer, makes a score that's exhilarating and high octane, keeping the film thrilling to watch. There is never a moment of film where, if I know Hans Zimmer did a score, or at the very least I find out he did one, there's never a point in time where I think that this man wasn't bringing it his all. This man clearly has a love and passion when it comes to film scores, and clearly he had a lot of influence from what John Woo did, but also what that era meant for with regards to a lot of action movies. And clearly he put a lot of effort and a lot of care into the score, and while I do think it is the most interesting one of all of the Mission Impossible scores, it is certainly one that definitely has its own unique flavor to it. The production is incredible. With an increased budget, because we're going from 80 million to now 120 million, the production crew was able to shoot the action on location this time, using vehicles for the stunts, and the quality is really, truly amazing to see, showcasing what the future for this series would continue to do and outdo itself with each film as it went along. If there's one thing I have to give this movie props, is that it did lay down the idea of, okay, we took the elements and we're trying to make it different, but if there is one thing that the series moving forward has done, is actually shooting things practically. And while I don't think the first movie didn't have practicality, because it did, but actually having the action being on location and actually shooting the action that way, rather than having a green screen, because I can say that that is kind of the downfall of the first movie, and that is the ending just does feel like it's out of place. Whereas to this, it's like, okay, because going forward, they actually make an attempt of trying to be as practical and on location as they can with those action sequences, and with the stunt team there. It's all impressive. It's all amazing. Aside from that, okay, aside from the impressive feel as well as the amazing talent that was put into this movie, it just falls into the trappings of what the era was. And what do I mean by the era, people? I mean the 2000s, or rather in this case, the era in which you saw a lot of people trying to just being post-Matrix. And also, of course, you had a lot of Chinese films being influenced in America. You saw a lot of that influence being carried throughout much of the 2000s, and for really trying to take the series in a different direction than what the first movie had done. And I think that's what they kind of still hold on to because of what happened with this movie. So here are the negatives. The story, if you ask me, is pretty boring. Nothing about Hunt tracking down a deadly virus was thrilling and engaging. It just all felt hollow. I think this could have worked if it didn't so much feel like it was trying so hard to take this really super duper duper seriously. Now, I'm not saying that they can't take it seriously, but when they are trying to make it super epic in the way it feels and how it flows, it just kind of comes off as kind of goofy and a little bit cartoonish, if you ask me, on trying to be super serious with this. And while I do think that it's not necessarily a bad thing of having a virus be, something Hunt is trying to track down, in execution, it just doesn't land in the way I hope it would. The writing is odd. Not only the dialogue feels off, but Hunt's characterization feels completely different as he feels more like James Bond than what he was like in the first film. And also, the team aspect is sorely lacking in this movie. If there is one thing, besides the dialogue being super stereotypical, cringy 2000s dialogue, Ethan Hunt, Tom Cruise. And now, listen, I am not saying that Ethan Hunt is still a bad character. I'm not saying that he is a poorly put together character. But in this movie, they legit tried to make him like James Bond. And I think that was because they were almost like trying to go down the route of wanting to be like James Bond. They wanted to be like the 007 series. Except the reason why the 007 series works is because James Bond is supposed to be a super spy. Compared to Ethan Hunt, if you watch the first movie and then the others after this one, he's supposed to be a vulnerable character. He's supposed to be a character that has problems. But a problem with it is that his stern demeanor that he had in the first movie is kind of gone. Yes, Ethan Hunt had to be charming, and even in the other movies, he still had to be charming at times. When he had to be. Throughout this entire movie, him and Thandiwe, they are trying so hard to get people to tell them, hey, we really like each other. We really want to bang each other. But it's like, we get it. There's so much sexual innuendo and so much sexual tension between the two of them. They just got to a point of like, this is really going to come into conflict with James Bond. And like I said, the team aspect of this movie that was kind of a little bit prevalent in the first, but still was there when you had Ving, Rhames, and Jean Reno, it's sorely lacking here. It's almost like they were obligated to be here because, oh wait, that's still part of the Mission Impossible series is having a team. Because if not, then Ethan would be doing everything. And I think that they have kind of gone back on that and they're like, all right, let's just go back to what the first movie kind of did. Because with this movie, yeah, it tried way too hard to be a little bit more action-packed with regards to having a main character doing everything. The villain is bland. Though having an ex-IMF agent could have been interesting, it kind of comes off as being your stereotypical bad guy. It's just really being about money is pretty much a very boring motivation unless Dougray Scott could be as interesting as he is, but the problem is he isn't. It's just like, okay, he's just a bad guy. Alright. Like, you're supposed to give me some entertainment value. And poor Dougray Scott, he's trying, but it's just not enough to save this movie, okay? It's just not. Like, as much as he could try, he's just not winning me over. He's just very much driven by money. That's it. All he is. And while I do think that there have been villains, like say like a Hans Gruber, Alan Rickman makes that character very interesting in how he performs it. Here, Dougray Scott, he's just playing this like how you would think a stereotypical villain would be. And that's it. And I just think that that's just a missed opportunity because you could have had something and you chose not to give this man anything to work with regards to making it a little bit more, I don't know, memorable, if you will. The editing is choppy. Every scene feels messy and poorly put together. Every action sequence feels sloppily edited. Now, this is where we're going to get into the problems that I have with the movie with regards to its action. That I don't necessarily think the action is necessarily bad, but how it's edited, it's very bad. But then again, most of this movie is edited very poorly, very much choppy, quick cut editing at times, making it so that way it just goes much faster. But honestly, with how it's handled, it just feels poorly put together, and I think that is the disappointing aspect, especially for an action movie. To be like this, that's a huge letdown. The slow motion is annoying. Anytime an action sequence or a dramatic scene happens, the slow motion just kills the film's excitement. It makes it pretty frustrating. Now, I could say that this may be editing, but really, the slow motion itself should have its own section because it almost becomes like a main character for this movie. And every time they use slow motion throughout this entire movie, it got on my goddamn nerves because I hate when action movies utilize slow motion every time. And that is pretty much pointing the fingers at some filmmakers out there today, cough cough, Zack Snyder, it frustrates me knowing that slow motion should be used for a money shot. People, a money shot. Not for the entire movie, a money shot. That is how it should work. Maybe once or twice is okay. If you are using it for most of your movie, it becomes so annoying and very much apparent that you are just trying to slow down this pacing. And while I don't think the pacing and runtime is necessarily bad, it just is annoying when slow motion does occur throughout this entire film. As a result, it feels like an average sequel that is out of place and very odd. Compared to the other movies in this franchise, it is very much the odd one out. For all of its upgrades, it falls short on improving on the first film. By the end of it, I found it bland. I found it generic. It wasn't necessarily a terrible movie. I didn't walk away thinking that this was awful or just garbage completely. There were aspects of this movie that I do appreciate and really respect. And while I do think that John Woo is a very talented director with regards to action, I just think that at times he took this a little bit too far, or rather, some of the editing or some of the story aspects of this movie just went a little bit too far in striving away from what the first movie had and something that was completely different compared to something like what James Bond was doing. And for this one to kind of fully be almost like James Bond in a way, I don't think that that was the right approach. And I'm kind of glad that they kind of course corrected after this movie, because it took them 6 years for another movie to come out. So it really shows that the effects of this movie kind of had an impact on the series and kind of made them rethink where they wanted to take it after this film. I'm going to give Mission Impossible 2 a 5 out of 10. I don't think this is a bad movie. It's not one that I don't think is deserving of like being terrible, but it is very much out of the series my least favorite, and I still think to this day it's just really bizarre that at one point that the Mission Impossible series wanted to be something a little bit different than what the first movie had, and they have now kind of course corrected it and kind of changed it to where we're at now. So yeah, I mean, in some ways you can kind of thank this movie for making sure that, all right, we should probably not try so hard to be like 007, but rather our own thing, and what the first movie, but rather the original series, had that a lot of people enjoy about it. I will be doing my review for Love Hurt very soon, so yes, look forward to those reviews and other movie TV show reviews coming soon.